The building management office at Terris Residential Complex used a single sheet of pale yellow paper to explain everything that mattered about Lena Vel Sorath. Dale Carn read it twice, standing in the corridor outside his apartment door, still wearing his jacket from the transit station. The paper was titled *Domestic Assistance Placement, Interspecies Housing Accord, Civilian Tier, Terris District*. It listed her name, her species, her service certification, her hours 6th hour to 14th hour, 4 days per week, and at the bottom, in smaller print, a line he had to hold the paper closer to read. Placement note: Vel Sorath domestic staff observe species standard distancing protocol with human residents. Please allow adequate physical clearance and avoid extended direct eye contact during service hours. These conventions are protective and mutually observed. For questions, contact the Accord Placement Coordinator at the address below. Dale folded the paper in half and put it in his jacket pocket. He was 34 years old, had lived alone for 6 of those years, and had specifically requested the domestic assistance placement because his last 3 months on the Harrow Station contract had left his apartment in a condition that could generously be described as geological. He hadn't requested a particular species. He'd requested someone competent and reliable, which was what the Accord placements were supposed to guarantee. He unlocked the door and went inside to wait. The apartment was a 2-room civilian unit on the 11th floor of Terris Block C, a front room with a low table, a reading chair with a lean to the left, a narrow kitchen alcove, a sleeping room with a window over the district transit corridor, which hummed at all hours. The floors were pale composite, the walls old cream. He'd been back 4 days and had made 3 attempts to address the kitchen, each ending with him standing in the alcove looking at the problem and then going to sit in his reading chair. The secondary shelf held an archaeology of intentions. The kitchen counter had scratches he couldn't account for. He was looking at the scratches when the knock came at the door. She was taller than he'd expected. The Vel Sorath were described in the transit welcome packets as humanoid, slender, and pale, which was accurate the way describing water as wet was accurate, technically correct, and leaving out everything that mattered. Lena Vel Sorath was tall enough that she had tilted her head slightly coming through the doorframe, a small practiced motion with the quality of something learned early and applied without thinking, the adjustment of someone who had been navigating human standard doorframes for some time. Her skin was the color of new ice, not white, not blue, but the specific pale, translucent shade of ice caught in morning light, before the sun has fully cleared the horizon, when the cold is still in the color. There was a faint luminescence at the edges of her jaw and the outer lines of her collarbones, the kind that was easy to miss in strong light, but was visible in the softer light of the corridor. Her hair was silver white and worn in a flat, practical coil at the back of her head, held with a single dark pin. Her eyes were large and pale amber. Vel Sorath eyes, he'd read, had a horizontal pupil like certain earth animals did, and the description had suggested something stranger than the reality, which was eyes that were amber and attentive and moved with a quick lateral precision when they scanned a room. She did not quite meet his directly. She looked at the midpoint of the room, at the space between them, and he had the sense that she was registering the apartment in that first glance with a thoroughness that his 4 days of standing in the kitchen alcove had not achieved. She was carrying a flat-sided cleaning kit in one hand and a small coordination tablet in the other. She was wearing a service uniform of dark gray and pale blue, the Accord domestic placement colors, which he recognized from the building manager's description, and she was standing with a particular quality of stillness that wasn't stiff exactly, but organized, contained. "Dale Carn," she said. Her standard was precise and careful, each word placed with the attention of someone who had learned it formally and used it with deliberate respect for the gaps between words. "I am Lena, placement through the Accord. I have your service schedule." She lifted the tablet slightly. "I will begin the initial assessment now, if that is acceptable." "Sure," he said. "Come in." She moved past him with a careful lateral step, maintaining what he estimated was about 2 arm lengths of distance, and began looking at the apartment. Her expression was perfectly neutral, and yet somehow communicated a great deal. He had the feeling that the apartment was being categorized in real time, not judged exactly, but understood, the way you understand a transit route by looking at a map before you run it. The placement note mentioned distancing protocol, he said. I read it. I'll try not to be in your way. She glanced at him briefly, the quick lateral scan of the horizontal pupils, landing just to the side of his face. Thank you, she said. The protocol is standard Vel Sorath practice with human residents. It is not a difficulty. It simply is. Right, he said. How does it usually go? I work from the far end of the space and move toward the resident's position, she said. This gives the resident time to adjust if needed. I do not require extended interaction during service hours. If you have preferences or requirements, you can note them in the coordination tablet. She looked at the kitchen counter, at the scratches. You should know that I will be thorough, she said, and that thorough will take longer on the first visit. I'm aware, he said. I was away for 3 months. She looked at the field manuals, at the scratches again, then at the secondary shelf with its archaeology of intentions. Yes, she said, in a tone that communicated nothing at all, which somehow communicated everything. He got out of her way. He worked from the reading chair that first day, with his headset in and his project files open on his personal screen, and tried not to watch her work. He failed at this approximately every 12 minutes. He was aware that the attempt to not watch was itself a form of watching, that the deliberate angling of his vision away from the kitchen, the careful direction of his attention back to his files, was producing a heightened awareness of her presence in the peripheral space that normal sight would have settled faster. He'd spent 3 months on the Harrow Station contract in close quarters with 6 other surveyors, and he was accustomed to working alongside other people. There was nothing unusual about another person being in the room. This was something slightly different from that, which he noticed, and then told himself was simply the novelty of the first day. She worked steadily and without commentary. He heard the careful organization of surfaces, the soft click of things being lifted and placed, the quiet scrape of a cabinet opening correctly for the first time in what was probably months, the particular sound of the cleaning kit being moved from one position to another. She worked with a sequencing that he couldn't quite map from his chair, but that seemed to follow some logic he'd have understood if he could have watched it directly. The precise silence that followed each completed section was different from the sound of still air. It was the silence of something being finished. At the second hour, she moved to the kitchen alcove. He heard the cabinets open, one by one, with something that might have been methodical and might have been resigned. Then a longer quiet, which he interpreted as assessment. At the third hour, he heard her say, very quietly, something in Vel Sorath, 2 syllables, a soft landing tone that curved slightly upward at the end. He didn't know what it meant. It sounded neither alarmed nor distressed. It had the quality of the word you said under your breath when you opened something, and found it contained exactly what you'd expected but had been hoping wasn't true. Everything okay in there? He called. A pause, not a startled pause, a considered one. Yes, she said. Your storage configuration is unconventional. I know, he said. I ran out of system at some point and improvised. I can see that, she said. She said it without inflection that he could identify as positive or negative. It was simply accurate. I will resolve it. He listened to her resolve it for the next 40 minutes. She was systematic. He could tell even from his chair the sequence of it, the way she worked from one end of the alcove to the other, the sound of things being correctly placed varying from the sound of things being placed as a temporary measure while something else was sorted. She was building a logic for the space, he realized, not just cleaning it. She was figuring out what the space wanted to be. When she came out of the alcove at the end of the 4th hour, she said, Your carafe sets. You have two. I know, he said. One is better suited to daily use. The other is guest appropriate. I have placed the daily one at primary access height and the other at secondary. She looked at her tablet. If you prefer another arrangement noted in the log. That arrangement is fine, he said. She nodded, went back to work. He thought, looking at the kitchen alcove, that he had not distinguished between the two carafe sets in 2 years. He had used whichever one his hand landed on first. He had not thought about the fact that one was slightly nicer than the other, and that placing them differently meant something about how he was treating himself and his space. He went back to his files. When she left, the apartment looked like a room where a person lived rather than a room where a geological event had occurred. She had not commented on any of it beyond the carafe sets. She had not offered suggestions or observations or the particular kind of careful professional judgment that comes dressed as neutrality. She had simply moved through the space and made it function, with the patient attention of someone who understood what she was doing and did not need to explain it. She left the coordination tablet's daily log open on the low table so he could see what had been done. The log was precise and detailed, room by room, cabinet by cabinet, the logic documented so he could understand it and work within it. At the door, she said, 4th day, 6th hour, which was when she was scheduled to return. See you then, he said. She nodded once, precise and small, and the door closed behind her. He stood in the kitchen alcove and looked at the newly organized cabinets for a while, at the daily carafe on the primary shelf, and the other one on the secondary, and the clear space where things were supposed to be and were now actually located. Then he went back to his reading chair and tried to remember what he'd been working on. Part 2, the study of distances. The first 2 weeks ran like a schedule printed on clean paper. 6th hour she arrived. 14th hour she left. Between those marks, she worked with the same steady attention, and he worked from his chair or from the transit office down the block, and the apartment was maintained in a state of organization that he had not achieved independently in 2 years. He learned her patterns slowly and without trying to. She started at the far end of the space from where he was working and moved toward him, which he eventually realized was deliberate. It gave him time to move if he needed to, and she passed him at the closest point while in motion, minimizing proximity duration. When she needed to cross his space, she moved directly without hovering. The protocol was something she applied as a given, not something she wanted him to notice her applying. She drank water from the kitchen alcove at intervals, always from the same pale green cup she'd brought in her kit on the first day. She did not eat during service hours. When she found something she'd reorganized and that he'd moved back, she reorganized it again without comment. He moved a stack of project binders back to the corner of the low table 3 times. On the 4th reorganization, there was a note in her careful standard. The secondary shelf holds reference materials that are used less than daily. This space functions better without them. He moved them to the secondary shelf. He did not mention it had worked. The distancing protocol became unremarkable by the end of the first week. It was simply a spatial vocabulary he learned, the way you learned a new transit route, the path she took, the distance she kept, where she expected him to move. She didn't look at him directly. The horizontal pupils tracked slightly to the side of his face when she needed to address him, which was not often. When she needed to clean around his chair, she waited until he stood aside, moved through quickly and moved back. It was a functional system. He had no complaints about it. He noticed things about her in the same peripheral way he'd noticed her work on the first day, at intervals, and with the quality of someone aware they were noticing and uncertain what to do with the information. Her hands, for instance. Vel Sorath's hands had a slightly longer middle 3 fingers than the outer 2, and the proportion was different from human hands in a way that only became apparent when you watched someone use them. The way she held her cleaning implements, the angle of her wrist when she organized a shelf, the particular precision of a hand built on a slightly different geometry. He'd looked up Vel Sorath anatomy once, briefly. He closed the search after 2 paragraphs, because something about the search felt like it was doing something other than what it was nominally doing. Her expression was the other thing. The Vel Sorath face was, he'd read, less mobile than a human face. The signaling worked through the eyes and quality of attention rather than movement of features. He couldn't read most of it. He caught things at the edges occasionally and had no way to know if he was reading them correctly. He'd caught the 2-syllable word on the first day, and once or twice after. Once when she found a cracked carafe in a back cabinet, once when she opened the window and heard a transit harmonic he'd apparently stopped noticing. He didn't ask what it meant. It seemed like something said to oneself, rather than to anyone else. It was at the end of the 3rd week that she spoke to him, outside the task and acknowledgement pattern for the first time. He'd been in the reading chair, and she'd moved around to clean the window frame, and he'd shifted left to give her room, and they'd briefly been closer than 2 arm lengths, maybe 2 seconds before he realized and stepped back. She hadn't stepped back. She finished the window frame. "Sorry," he said, "moved the wrong direction." "It was not a problem," she said. A pause, the deliberate selection kind. "My species is taught that human proximity is unpredictable. The protocol is designed to prevent situations that cannot be managed. It is not specifically that humans are dangerous. Just unpredictable. The training uses different language," she said, "but yes." He went back to his screen and read the same paragraph 4 times. Part 3, the word she kept saying. The word was *Velarath*. He heard it for the 4th time in the 5th week. She said it while reorganizing his secondary shelf, where he'd put 3 objects back in positions she'd already corrected twice, and he finally asked. She went still for a moment, not tense, organized, the kind of stillness that was arranging a response rather than reacting to a question. "It is a Vel Sorath word," she said. "It does not translate directly." "What does it approximately mean?" She looked at the shelf, not at him. "It is the word for a thing that is placed wrong but not incorrectly. A thing in a position that requires adjustment but that was placed with evident intention." A pause. "It is not a negative word." He thought about this. "So when you say it about my shelf organization, it means I understand what you intended and I can see why you did it this way and there is a better way," she said. She glanced at him briefly, the horizontal pupils in the amber sweeping across slightly to the side of his face, and looked back at the shelf. "It is not a criticism. It is more like recognition." "Velarath," he said. She made the small stillness, the Vel Sorath double take, as he'd come to think of it, the momentary reorganization that preceded a thing she hadn't expected. "Your pronunciation is good," she said, with the specific quality of someone who was saying an accurate thing they hadn't anticipated being able to say. "I have a transit background," he said. "I've picked up pieces of a few languages. Some words stick better than others." She looked at him again, slightly longer than the quick scan, the amber eyes resting at the edge of his face for a count of 2 before returning to the shelf. "Which languages?" "Some Vel Tanith, broken Vel Orath, enough Vel Sorath to order food and apologize for ordering badly. A few terms in Old Vel Sorath northern dialect that a colleague taught me, though I think I've lost most of them." She said something. It was 3 syllables, and he recognized the first one, Vel, and then the landing of the last one, which had that particular upward curve he'd been hearing since the first day. It was the Vel Sorath word for *river*, the word that meant a pleasant surprise, a thing that arrived and moved through you. "Was that Vel Sorath," he asked, "the river word?" The stillness again. "Yes," she said. "I did not expect," she stopped, started again with the deliberate placement she used for things that mattered. The Vel Sorath are Eastern dialect cluster. Vel Sorath is Western cluster. They are related but distinct. Most humans who learn any Vel language learn Eastern cluster dialects because the Accord trade corridors run primarily through Eastern territory. She looked at the shelf. Most humans do not learn Western cluster languages. I had a very patient teacher on the Harrow Station run, he said. Cargo run, Western corridor, Vel Sorath Outer Station was the third dock. I spent 3 months on that leg. My dock colleague was Vel Sorath and had opinions about humans who worked alongside him without knowing any of the courtesy terms. Reasonable opinions, she said. Extremely reasonable, he agreed. I learned fast. She looked at the shelf again, reorganized it with the small, precise motions he'd spent 5 weeks watching without watching the lateral spread of those middle fingers, the particular economy of a hand that knew what it was doing. Then she said, without looking at him, what was the route? The full Harrow run. He told her. She asked questions, which stations, which corridor configurations, the specific protocol at Vel Sorath Outer Station. They talked for 11 minutes. He knew it was 11 minutes because his screen timed out while they were talking and the idle indicator came on. It was the longest conversation they'd had. She asked about the route with the same precision she brought to everything, and he answered with the attention those questions deserved. At some point he realized she'd moved closer than usual without either of them acknowledging it. Not dramatically close. 1 arm length maybe. She realized it at the same moment and stepped back to 2 arm lengths and went back to work. He thought about it for 3 hours after she left that day. He made himself stop thinking about it, and he mostly succeeded. The second conversation happened in the 7th week and was longer. He'd come back from the transit office in the afternoon. A route assessment had run long because the data source conflict at the third junction turned out to be 2 separate errors in 2 separate data sets rather than one, which was less efficient to discover but more satisfying to resolve. And he found her standing at the window with his small cactus on the sill. The cactus was a ceramic pot containing a plant that had arrived as a housewarming gift from a colleague 3 years ago. His colleague had described it as nearly indestructible. He'd been testing this claim, not deliberately, but through the accumulated neglect of someone who forgot the cactus was there for weeks at a time, and then remembered it and felt guilty and overwatered it, which he'd been told was worse than forgetting it entirely. It looked like it had been through something. This plant, she said when he came in. I know, he said, it's like that because of me. It does not look bad, she said. She turned it slightly in her hands, the Vel Sorath geometry of her fingers precise and careful. It looks like it has been deciding. She set it back on the sill, rotated to a different angle than it had been in, facing toward the light that came through the transit corridor window from the east in the morning. This direction. It needs the morning angle. He set down his bag. How do you know? The growth leans, she said. She pointed at the slight asymmetry in the cactus's shape, the way it had been pulling itself for months toward a light source it couldn't quite find. It has been trying to find the correct angle without help. I have placed it where it was trying to get to. She stepped back and looked at it. It will settle now. You know cactus growth patterns. I have a cactus, she said, with the tone of someone who found the question slightly unnecessary. A different species but similar logic. The Vel Sorath district housing I am in has good light in the upper floors. I grow what the light allows. He looked at the cactus in its new position. It did, he thought, look more like it had arrived somewhere rather than like it was in the middle of looking. What else do you grow? He asked. She described her plants with the same precision and care she brought to everything, names in Vel Sorath first, which she translated when she saw he didn't have them. Growth conditions stated not as requirements but as the logic of the individual plant, what it was trying to do and what it needed to do it. She had 7 plants. A pale climbing vine that Vel Sorath called *Velthurin*, which meant the thing that finds its direction by trying. A broad-leafed gray succulent with almost no water requirement and opinions about light angle. A small flowering plant she described as difficult, meaning that it had a narrow range of conditions in which it would bloom and was worth maintaining for the bloom. 2 small cacti of different species, both distinct from the one on his windowsill, which she described with the patient specificity of someone who understood the differences mattered. And 2 plants she'd had so long she'd stopped translating their names and gave them only in Vel Sorath. She knew all of them in the way you knew something you'd paid long attention to, not as a fact but as a relationship, the accumulated understanding of a living thing's particular logic over time. He found himself asking questions he hadn't planned to ask, because each answer generated a natural next question about the system she was describing. The climbing one, does it need structure to find direction, or does it find direction on its own? Both, she said. It needs something to grow toward. It does not need to be told which direction. If you give it support anywhere, it will find the rest. And if you give it no support at all, then it finds a direction that is not useful and grows very committed to it. She looked at the cactus on the sill, the one that had been committed to a non-useful direction for months. They are not so different in that way. He didn't say anything to that. He wasn't entirely sure what there was to say. The service hour ended at the 14th. She continued talking. He continued listening. At some point after the 14th, he didn't check his screen because he didn't want to interrupt the conversation to do it. She looked at her coordination tablet as she reached for her service kit and made the small stillness that meant something had arrived unexpectedly. "I am past service hours," she said. "I noticed," he said. "I didn't want to interrupt." She looked at him, longer than the quick scan, longer than the 1-minute mark she'd reached in the 5th week, longer than anything that fit comfortably within the parameters of the distancing protocol. "I did not notice," she said. The quality of her voice on it was slightly different from usual. The careful placement of each word was still there, but under it was something that wasn't caution. Something that was sitting with a thing it had just identified. "Same time on the 10th?" he asked. The 10th was her next scheduled day. "Yes," she said. 6th hour." She picked up her kit. At the door she paused, and he thought she was going to say something about the schedule or the cactus or the plants. Instead she said quietly, "Vel Sorath." She was not looking at the shelf. She was not looking at the apartment at all. She was looking at the door in front of her. He didn't ask what it was for. He had the feeling it was for something that both of them already knew and that neither of them was ready to name, and asking would be pressing before the time was right. She let herself out, and he stood at the window for a while with the cactus in its new position, facing the morning light. Part 4. What her species was taught. In the 9th week, he came back from a transit survey that had run long and found her in the kitchen alcove, standing very still, looking at her coordination tablet with an expression he'd never seen on her before. "Everything all right?" he asked. She looked up. The amber eyes found his and stayed direct held. "I have been asked to submit a reassignment request." He put his bag down. "Why?" "The Accord placement coordinator conducted a welfare check. I said the placement was going well. They asked about protocol compliance." She looked at the tablet. "I told them standard." "Is it?" The pause was its own answer. "Less so than in the first weeks. I told them standard." He waited. "They received an observation report from building management, suggesting our distances have varied." She set the tablet face down on the counter. "The coordinator reminded me the protocol is protective, that Vel Sorath are taught human romantic attention is consuming, that humans form attachments quickly and do not release them, that a Vel Sorath who allows proximity to become habit risks becoming the object of an attachment she did not choose." A pause. "The framing suggests the attachment happens to the Vel Sorath, that she is acted upon, that the proximity is the danger." "That's what you were taught?" "Yes." by people who wrote materials before the third expansion, referencing population distributions and social patterns that are not current anthropological understanding. She reorganized the clear space on the counter. The placement office has not updated the cultural orientation materials in 11 years, I asked. The coordinator said they are under review. Under review for 11 years. Apparently, she picked up the tablet. I have not submitted the request. I wanted to tell you what had happened. I did not want you to find out through the building management without being told by me. I appreciate that, he said. She went back to work. He sat in his chair and thought about how long you could believe a document before the experience contradicting it became impossible to ignore. She did not submit the reassignment request. She came back on the 12th, 2 days after the scheduled 10th, and he didn't ask why. At the second hour, she said, from the secondary shelf, I looked at the early Accord materials. And they are very old. The foundational claims cannot be traced to primary sources. The framing treats human attachment as projection, something humans do regardless of the other party's signals, which is not what current social psychology describes. She reorganized something on the shelf. The early framing appears to have been based on a small number of poorly documented early contact incidents. I looked for current sources. There are not many. What did you conclude? She was quiet. Then, without turning from the shelf, I concluded that I had been afraid of something I learned from a document written before I was born, about a species I have worked alongside for 9 weeks, and that the document and the species are not the same thing. A pause. I have been testing its claims against my experience. The document is wrong about most of them. He waited. He'd learned the things she said that mattered came in pairs. I also concluded, she said more quietly, that I am not afraid anymore, which is a separate matter. She turned and looked at him, directly, both eyes. The full amber attention held longer than she'd looked at him since the first day. Then she turned back to the shelf. Velareth, she said, quietly, not about the shelf. Part 5, the cactus bloomed. The cactus bloomed in the 11th week. He noticed it on a morning when she wasn't scheduled. Early, before he'd done anything else. Because the light was coming in at the angle she'd established, and the window caught it first, and his eye went to the window because it always did now. A habit formed over 4 weeks of mornings when she'd repositioned the cactus, and the morning light had started landing differently. A single small flower, pale yellow, at the tip of the growth that had been leaning for months. The growth that had been trying to find the right angle before she'd found it for it. He stood at the window for a while and looked at it. It was smaller than he'd expected a cactus flower to be, and more precise. The petals very clean, very even, the yellow of early light rather than the yellow of warmth. It had bloomed while no one was watching, the way things that have been preparing for a long time sometimes do, without announcement, without the anticipation of an audience. It had simply arrived because the conditions had been right long enough. He sent her a message through the coordination tablet system, which was the only means of contact they had outside of service hours. The system was meant for schedule changes and service notes, and he was using it for something else, which he was aware of. Your cactus advice worked. It bloomed. The reply came 4 hours later, which was faster than the coordination system usually ran. Vel Sorath. What color? He looked at the flower for a moment. He'd never sent an image through the coordination system before, but the system had the function. He took a small, careful image and attached it. Yellow. The pale kind, like early morning. A longer pause this time. He put his screen down and went to the transit office and came back, and the reply was there. That is rare for this species. It blooms when the conditions have been exactly right for some time, not just recently. Most people do not notice until it has already happened. He thought about how to answer that for a while. He thought about 9 weeks and the word on the shelf and the 1 arm length in the 5th week, and the 7th-week conversation about the climbing vine that needs something to grow toward. He thought about what asterisk conditions have been exactly right for some time meant, applied to something other than a cactus. He wrote, "I've been paying attention." No reply for the rest of the day. On the 12th, she came at 6th hour, on time, exactly, as always, and did not begin the usual circuit of the apartment. She went directly to the window and looked at the flower without touching it. He stayed in his reading chair and watched her look at it. Her expression was the quiet one, not blank, not neutral, but contained, the way the small flowering plant she described in the 7th week was contained, holding a thing in the narrow range of conditions that kept it from opening. The amber eyes were soft in the morning light, the horizontal pupils resting on the flower without moving. "It won't last long," he said, "the flower." "No," she said, "a few days, then the plant goes back to what it does." She turned from the window. Her expression when she turned was still quiet, still contained, but the thing it was containing was visible in a way that hadn't been visible before, the shape of it at least, if not the detail. "But it will bloom again if the conditions continue." He looked at the cactus, then at her. "Will they?" She looked at him directly, the full amber attention 3 seconds for. "I believe so," she said. She went to work. He went to his reading chair. The window light came in at the angle she'd found, and the cactus sat in it, and the flower lasted 5 days, as she'd predicted, and when it closed and fell and the cactus went back to what it did, the plant was very slightly larger than it had been before, the growth a little taller, the lean resolved into something that was no longer leaning, something that had found its direction and was now simply in it. The conversation in the 13th week was the one that changed things. She had stayed past service hours again. This had been happening more frequently, by degrees, over the last 4 weeks, without either of them naming it or scheduling it or acknowledging it as anything other than a conversation that hadn't finished. He'd stopped watching the hour on his screen. She'd stopped checking the coordination tablet after the 12th. They were talking about the Harrow Station route. He'd been describing the last leg of the run, the corridor between Vel Sorath Outer Station and the terminus at Harrow itself, which was long and quiet, and had a particular quality at the end of a shift that he'd tried to describe before and had never quite landed correctly. "Like what?" she asked. She was sitting on the kitchen alcove counter. She'd started doing that at some point in the last 4 weeks, settling on the counter with her coordination tablet set aside and her hands in her lap rather than standing at the edge of the room. He hadn't mentioned it. It seemed like something that would become smaller if he mentioned it. "You said you tried to describe it once to a colleague, and they didn't understand what you meant." She said it sounded like missing something that was still there, he said, which was close but not quite it. "What is it?" He thought about it. "Like the end of something you didn't know was important until it was ending," he said. "The corridor's very long, dark mostly. Just the indicator lights and the hum of the drive, and the sound the dock makes when it receives at the other end. You learn that sound, after enough runs. You learn every indicator's timing, every vibration in the transit frame, every small mechanical conversation the ship has with itself on that specific route. And at the end of a shift, when you've been running the same corridor for months, you know it perfectly, more than you know most things, and you pull out for the last time, and the thought that arrives is, I knew that. I knew that completely, and I will probably never know it again exactly that way." She was quiet for a moment. "Vel Sorath," she said. "The river word." "Yes," she said. "When something surprises you pleasantly." She looked at her hands in her lap, the longer middle fingers, the geometry he'd been watching for 13 weeks. But it can also mean the feeling when you recognize something you did not know you had been looking for. The two meanings are related in Vel Sorath. We do not separate them. "Because they feel the same," he said. "Because they are the same thing, arrived at from different directions," she said. "The surprise and the recognition. One is the thing unexpected. The other is the thing expected but unfound. But the arrival feels the same, the shift in the chest, the kind of stillness that is not absence but attention. He looked at her on the kitchen counter in the late afternoon light from the transit corridor window, the silver white of her hair loose at the edges of the coil in a way it hadn't been at the start of the day, the faint luminescence at the line of her jaw stronger in the warm, angled light. He thought about 13 weeks of gradually shifting distances, and Vel Sorath said at shelves, and the cactus aimed toward its light, and the coordination tablet message about conditions being exactly right for some time. Vel Sorath are taught, she said, that humans feel things quickly, that the feeling arrives before it is decided, that the attachment is present before the choice is made. She paused. She was still looking at her hands. Is that accurate? For some things, he said, not this. She looked up, the amber eyes direct. No. This was slow, he said. This is the slowest thing I've felt in a long time. It was slow enough that I could see all of it. There was nothing that arrived before I knew what it was. She was quiet. Then, for me also, she said. She said it carefully, each word placed, the quality she used when she was saying something that had been waiting to be said for a long time. My species was taught that we could not want this freely, that wanting this would be a thing that happened to us rather than a thing we chose, a consequence of insufficient protocol. An attachment formed on us by a human rather than by us toward a human. She paused. I have been learning for several weeks that this is not what wanting feels like. What does wanting feel like? He asked. She was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the window, at the afternoon light, at the cactus on the sill in its position, the position she'd found for it, that had let it bloom. Like the cactus, she said, not being told to lean but leaning, not being moved but moving, because the conditions were right and the light was there and it chose the direction it was already choosing. She looked back at him. The document said the wanting happened to us. The document was wrong. I have been wanting for several weeks and it has not happened to me. I have been doing it. Every time I did not submit the reassignment request. Every time I stayed past service hours. Every Vel Sorath I said when I was not talking about a shelf. He held her gaze. The full amber attention, both eyes, the horizontal pupils resting on his face without drift. He'd spent 13 weeks in the periphery of that attention, and now it was direct and it was not difficult. It was the most natural thing. You've been moving toward it, he said. I have been trying, she said, to determine if the conditions were mutual. I have been gathering data as my species does, looking at what the evidence said. A pause. The evidence has been very consistent. He looked at her. Silver white hair and amber eyes, and the faint luminescence at the jaw that was stronger in the warm afternoon light. The Vel Sorath geometry of her hands in her lap, and the small, precise stillnesses, and the word said at shelves that was not about shelves. The conditions are mutual, he said. She looked at him for a long time, the full attention, unguarded in a way he hadn't seen from her before. The containment he'd come to know was still there, but it was open, the way something is open when it has decided to be. Not thrown wide, that wasn't her, wasn't how she moved through anything, but open the way a door is open when someone has chosen to leave it that way. Vel Sorath, she said softly. Which meaning? He asked. Both, she said. It is always both. Part 6, the new protocol. She came back the next scheduled day, and the day after, and the one after that. The distances changed, not all at once, but in the way that things change when they've already changed and are now arranging themselves around the new reality of it. She stopped doing the careful lateral step past him in doorways. She stopped timing her circuits to arrive at his chair at the point of maximum motion, the position that minimized the duration of proximity. She moved through the space the way she'd always moved through the space when he wasn't in it, directly, at her own pace, with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. And he moved around her when she needed room, and she moved around him, and neither of them tracked the distances anymore. The apartment changed in the way that spaces change when the people in them change. Not the furniture. He still had the reading chair with the left lean, the low table, the kitchen alcove with its organized logic, but the quality of the space, the feeling of it. It was a room where two people worked alongside each other now. That was different from a room where one person worked while another tried not to watch. The building management did not file another observation report. He supposed that either the observation had stopped or the report criteria had changed, and he didn't investigate which. He learned, over the following weeks, the full names of her 7 plants. He learned that Vel Sorath was technically a navigation term, the word for a route not wrong but not optimal, and that it had been applied colloquially for generations to anything placed with evident intention in a position that clearer understanding would adjust. He learned she had been applying it to him since at least the 2nd week. "Since the 2nd week," he said. "The 1st week I was still determining if the pattern was consistent," she said. "You were patient," he said. "I was gathering data," she said. "My species does not move quickly. The naming is not the slow part. Trusting the evidence is the slow part." She adjusted the shelf item she'd been reorganizing. "I trust it now," she said. She brought one of her plants to the apartment in the 16th week, a small gray-green succulent with silver-edged leaves, which she carried in on the 6th hour as though this were part of the service arrangement, and placed on the secondary shelf, and then adjusted 3 times before she was satisfied with the angle. He watched this from his reading chair. "Is that permanent?" he asked. "It prefers more light than my district housing allows," she said. She stepped back and looked at the shelf, tilted her head, adjusted the succulent a 4th time by approximately the width of a finger. "The secondary shelf has good morning light. The cactus has demonstrated that." "It's welcome here," he said. She looked at the plant. "I know," she said. "That is why I brought it." She said it simply, without emphasis, with the quality she gave to accurate statements that didn't require decoration. Then she went back to her work. He stood and looked at the gray-green succulent for a while, with its silver edges catching the morning light from the window, and thought about conditions and proximity and things that happened gradually, until they had already happened, and about the particular satisfaction of looking at something and knowing it was in the right place. He asked her to dinner in the 17th week. He asked in the way he asked things, directly, without circling it, without the construction of an approach that would let both of them pretend it wasn't what it was. He'd been thinking about how to do it for 2 weeks, which for him was long. He'd concluded that doing it the way he did everything else was the only way that made sense, the only way that was consistent with 17 weeks of not being anything other than what he was. "The Vel Sorath restaurant on the transit block has a seasonal menu," he said. "The winter menu. I'd like to go before it closes. Would you come?" She had been reorganizing the secondary shelf. The succulent had been doing well and had expanded slightly, requiring adjustment of the surrounding items to accommodate its new footprint, which she did with the same precision she applied to everything, and she went still in the Vel Sorath way. Not tense. Still. The organized stillness that preceded a considered response. "That would be," she said carefully, "outside service hours." "Yes," he said. She turned and looked at him. The amber eyes, the horizontal pupils, the contained expression with the thing he'd been learning to read for 17 weeks moving behind it. The accord placement coordinator would consider that a significant variation from protocol, she said. "Probably," he said. The document she would cite would be 11 years old and listed as under review. "Almost certainly." She looked at him for a moment with the quality of consideration that preceded her most careful sentences. Then she said, with the tone of someone who had been making a decision for much longer than the conversation had been happening, "The Vel Sorath restaurant posted their winter menu at the beginning of the month. I have been looking at it." "I know," he said. "You mentioned it in the 9th week, that you wanted to go since they opened the seasonal menu." She made the small stillness. I mentioned it once, she said, briefly. I pay attention, he said. She was quiet. She looked at the secondary shelf, at the succulent with its silver-edged leaves and its expanded footprint, doing well in the morning light. At the cactus on the window, which had bloomed twice now and was on its way to a third time, the growth taller than it had been before she'd repositioned it. At the front room of the apartment, which was organized with the logic of someone who had learned what the space needed and had arranged it for what it needed, not just for what was convenient. I used to be afraid, she said, that human attention was the kind you could not manage, that it arrived and changed things before you had decided whether you wanted them changed. She paused. My training told me that the attention came first and the consent followed, and that by the time you had the choice was already made for you. She looked at him. I have spent 17 weeks learning that this is not what your attention is, that it is the other kind, the kind that arrives and waits, does not change anything, waits to see if the change would be wanted. I waited, he said. You waited, she said, through 9 weeks of the protocol and through the reassignment request I did not submit and through the Vel Sorath I said at things that were not shelves. She held his gaze. You paid attention and you waited and you did not push. I wasn't going to push, he said. I know, she said. That is what I learned. She picked up her coordination tablet and her cleaning kit from the low table and set them both by the door, with the precise placement she used for things that were done. Then she came back to the center of the room and stood in front of him, not at any particular measured distance, just close, the way she moved through the space now, the ordinary closeness of two people who had learned each other's geography. Saturday, she said, 7th hour. The winter menu runs through the end of the month. Saturday, he said, 7th hour. She looked at him directly, both eyes, no lateral drift, the full amber attention. He knew what this meant. He'd been learning it in increments since the 5th week, when she'd stood at a window and described 7 plants with the care of someone who paid long attention to the things that mattered to her, and he'd realized he was being given something without it being announced. Vel Sorath, she said, both meaning simultaneously because in Vel Sorath they were not separate. Then she went to the door and picked up her kit and let herself out, and he stood in the front room with the cactus on the sill and the succulent on the shelf and the transit corridor humming its constant rhythm outside, and thought about patience and light, and the things that lean in the right direction before the bloom arrives, the ones that are already moving toward what they need long before anyone notices. Epilogue Conditions. The Vel Sorath restaurant was on the ground level of the transit block, 8 minutes from Terris Block C, which was close enough that they walked. She'd let her hair down. He'd never seen it down before, always in the service coil, the flat practical arrangement, and he'd known it was longer than that suggested, but not how much. It fell to her shoulders, silver white, catching the transit corridor lights. She was wearing a coat he hadn't seen, deep gray-blue, Vel Sorath fabric, heavier than it looked, and she walked at his pace without managing the distance, just walking. He didn't mention the hair. It seemed like something that would become less if he named it. The restaurant had small tables near the window that looked out over the transit block approach. They were given one of those tables, which he'd requested when he'd made the reservation, because she'd mentioned in the 9th week that she liked watching transit traffic from a stationary position, the quality of seeing movement from a place that was not itself moving. She ordered for both of them, in Vel Sorath that was fluent and precise, and that included the specific seasonal preparation of a particular dish that she had apparently confirmed with the server was available tonight. The server, Vel Sorath, young, with the amber eyes and the lateral scan, looked between them once with an expression that completed its assessment quickly, and then moved on with the practiced ease of someone who worked in a restaurant frequented by many kinds of people on many kinds of evenings. The winter menu was, as she described it from the posted listing, weighted toward the coastal preparation style of Eastern Vel Sorath. lighter than the inland dishes, with the specific seasoning register that used the Velmyra harvest to balance the sharp coastal flavors. He'd had enough Vel Sorath food over enough runs on the western corridor to have developed genuine preferences, and the preparation was the best version of those preferences he'd had outside of the actual restaurant district on Vel Sorath Outer Station. They talked for 3 hours. He told her about the Harrow Station run, not the route data but the texture of it. The third-to-last leg where the corridor narrowed and the ship registered it before the instruments did. The dock at Vel Sorath Outer Station on a morning arrival, the light through the east-facing ports going gold for 7 minutes before the sun moved off it. He'd run that dock for 3 months and knew it the way she knew her plants. She told him about the district housing, the lower floor unit she'd had for 2 years before the upper floor became available, with its insufficient light and the succession of plants she'd tried and eventually lost. The conditions, what they'd needed, what the unit couldn't provide. The upper floor unit, he said. Yes, I applied twice before it was available. She looked at her plate, the angle she used for things she was also thinking about. I remember standing in it for the first time, just standing at the window, watching what the light did. What did it do? It was sufficient, she said. That was the whole thing, the right amount at the right angle. The plants I'd moved in with me were simply going to be fine. That must have felt good. It felt like myself, she said. I had simply learned by that point what that required. He looked at her across the small table, in the warm amber light of the restaurant, with her silver-white hair and her amber eyes, and the faint luminescence at the line of her jaw that was visible in the candlelight, stronger in candlelight than in any other light he'd seen her in. The edge of her jaw lit like something alive and specific and entirely itself. Vel Sorath, he thought, both meanings, the pleasant surprise and the recognition of the thing you'd been looking for. She reached across the table and touched his hand. Light, the precise geometry of Vel Sorath fingers, the slightly longer middle 3 with their different proportion, the quality of a touch placed with intention rather than impulse. She left her hand there. I was afraid, she said, for a long time, of something I had never tested. A document described it and I believed the document, and the fear was the document's fear and not a fear I had arrived at myself. She looked at his hand, at hers. I am not afraid anymore. I know, he said. I know you know, she said. You have known for some time. You waited for me to know it myself. Outside the window, the transit corridor moved with its evening rhythm. Ships inbound from the approach, indicator lights cycling through their sequence, the dock mechanism sound carrying faintly through the glass. He thought about long routes and the end of shifts, and the thing that was finished you hadn't known was important until it was ending, and about this, which was not ending, which was arranged around its beginning with the unhurried patience of things that had been building toward this long enough to do it correctly. Velarath, he said. She looked at him, the amber eyes, the full attention. What is misplaced? Nothing, he said. Nothing is misplaced. That's the whole point of it. She understood what he meant. He saw it land in the amber eyes, the recognition that arrived like the river word, like the thing you didn't know you'd been looking for until it was right in front of you and the looking was over. The small warm shift in the contained expression, the thing that meant more from her than an open smile from most people, because it was something she gave carefully to things that deserved it. She left her hand on his. Vel Sorath, she said softly, both meanings as always, as in Vel Sorath they were never separate. He turned his hand over and held hers, her fingers and his, the geometry of 2 different shapes that had, over 17 weeks, become familiar to each other. Outside, the transit corridor ran its perpetual evening route. The winter menu was better than either of them had expected, which was the right way for a first dinner to be. The conditions were exactly right. They had been building to this for some time, and neither of them had noticed until it was already here, and it was here, and it was sufficient, and it was more than that.